I hope this week has been kind to you, or at least kind enough. Preparing for this examination is a strange kind of pressure. It asks for years of your life while never quite telling you if it is working. That quiet weight is real, and so is the excitement every time a new event lands in your hands, ready to be turned into marks. You are watching the Sociology Desk, issue 74. Today we take up four events: a doxing campaign in Delhi, a border crisis in Europe, an artificial intelligence project aimed at India's informal women workers, and a Supreme Court ruling on live-in couples. Four events, four thinkers, four ways to move from an average answer to a top one. Let us begin. Our first event comes from Paper 1 under Politics and Society, specifically the subunit on nation, state, citizenship, democracy, civil society, and ideology. After the recent Delhi protests over the paper leak, several young women who took part were doxed. That is, their photographs, addresses, and personal details were circulated online by anonymous accounts, followed by coerced public apology videos and, in some cases, police complaints. This is not just a news story. It is a textbook illustration of how power now disciplines people without the state ever issuing a direct order. Here is the concept you must anchor this answer on: disciplinary power operating through visibility. The idea, going back to the philosopher Michel Foucault, is that power works best not when it punishes you directly, but when the mere possibility of being watched makes you police your own behavior. Foucault illustrated this with the design of a prison, where a single watchtower can discipline hundreds of prisoners simply because none of them know exactly when they are being observed. Now replace the watchtower with a smartphone camera and an anonymous social media account. The doxing of a handful of women protesters disciplines thousands of others who now think twice before attending a protest at all, because they too could be identified, photographed, and circulated. That is Foucault's mechanism, transported from the prison yard to the group chat. If you remember one line from Michel Foucault for this answer, remember this. In his book Discipline and Punish, Foucault argued that the perfection of power tends to make its actual use unnecessary, because the watched individual takes on the constraints of power and imposes them upon himself. Write that formulation into your answer in your own words, and you have immediately signaled to the examiner that you know where this concept comes from, not just what it means. Now let me put on the examiner's hat for a moment, because this is the slide that actually moves your score. An answer that scores around 14 out of 20 will describe the doxing incident in some detail, mention that it is bad for women's safety, and perhaps gesture vaguely at surveillance. An answer that scores 18 or 19 out of 20 does something structurally different. It opens with the concept: disciplinary power operating through visibility, not with the description of the protest. It names Foucault and the Panopticon precisely, then uses the doxing episode in 1 or 2 sentences only as evidence, not as the story you are telling. It adds a second thinker in tension, for instance, Goffman on the collapse of a person's private and public self, or Partha Chatterjee on how the state treats dissenters as a population to be managed rather than as rights-bearing citizens. And it closes by pointing to what remains unresolved. Here, the fact that India has no dedicated law against doxing at all. That sequence, concept first, event as evidence, a counter-thinker, and a forward-looking closing line, is what separates the two scripts. The event is your evidence. The theory is your destination. Say that to yourself every time you sit down to write. Here is a probable question built directly from this event. In the light of the doxing of women protesters after the 2026 Delhi paper leak agitation, examine how Goffman's dramaturgical perspective illuminates the collapse of the private and public self online. Notice the structure: a current event followed by a demand to apply a named thinker's named concept. That is exactly the architecture you should expect and practice. Our second event moves to paper 1 again, this time under social change in modern society, specifically development and dependency. Late last week, around 50,000 migrants rushed across a breakwater from Morocco into Ceuta, a Spanish enclave that sits on African soil. Even though irregular crossings into the European Union had actually fallen by over a third this year, the incident triggered a wave of criticism against Spain from across the continent within days. That gap between the falling numbers and the rising panic is exactly what a good sociological answer must explain. The anchor concept here is dependency theory, associated with the thinker A.G. Frank. Frank argued that the wealth of the developed core is not simply separate from the poverty of the periphery, it is actually produced through that poverty. The two are two sides of one historical process. Ceuta makes this abstract argument almost embarrassingly literal. It is a piece of Europe sitting physically on African soil, so the periphery's citizens need only cross a single breakwater to step into the juridical territory of the core. You will rarely find a better real-world illustration of the metropolis-satellite relationship than this one. For your quotation arsenal, remember this formulation from A.G. Frank's work, Capitalism and Underdevelopment in Latin America. The development of the metropolis and the underdevelopment of the satellite are two sides of a single historical process. Do not present development and underdevelopment as two separate stories happening side by side. Frank's whole point, and the point that will earn you marks, is that they are one single process. Here is the examiner's view again. A 14-mark answer will describe the Ceuta crossing, mention that Europe is anxious about migration, and stop there. A 19-mark answer goes one step further. It explains not just the inequality, but the disproportionate reaction to it. Why did criticism of Spain explode even as actual crossings were falling? This is where you bring in a second thinker, Manuel Castells, and his idea that the space of flows, the instant circulation of images and information, now outpaces the space of places, actual territory, and actual numbers. You could add a third move, Durkheim's idea that a threatened group reasserts its collective identity by drawing a sharp boundary around an outsider, regardless of the real scale of the threat. Three thinkers, three distinct jobs: structural inequality from Frank, the speed of panic from Castells, the symbolic boundary work from Durkheim. That is a structured argument, not a travelogue of the incident. Here is a probable question from this event. To what extent does the political reaction to the 2026 Ceuta border crossings illustrate Durkheim's argument that collective sentiment reasserts itself against a perceived external threat? Notice the verb, to what extent. It demands a position on a spectrum, not a simple yes or no. Our third event is from paper 2, under Industrialization and Urbanization in India, the informal sector. There is a growing push to use artificial intelligence to identify and reach India's informal women workers, women whose labor participation has risen sharply, from roughly a quarter to over 2/5 of the workforce within half a decade, even as land ownership, credit, and formal contracts continue to elude almost all of them. The question you must ask, and the question your answer must ask, is whether an algorithm can fix a problem that was never really about visibility in the first place. Anchor this answer on Karl Marx's concept of the reserve army of labor. Marx's argument was that capitalism does not simply tolerate a surplus, unemployed, or under-recognized workforce. It actually requires one, because the insecurity of that reserve disciplines the wages and conditions of everybody else. Women now form a rising share of exactly this reserve in India, counted in the statistics but excluded from land, credit, and contracts. When you hear that artificial intelligence will now be used to reach these workers, do not read that as empowerment by default. Read it, following the thinker Frederick Taylor and his idea of scientific management, as a new, more precise way of monitoring and fragmenting labor, without necessarily extending the wage floor or the bargaining power that real recognition would require. Here is your quotable formulation from Karl Marx, Capital. Capitalist accumulation constantly produces a relatively surplus population, a reserve army, whose very availability regulates the wages of those already in work. Use this precisely and then extend it. Do not just describe informal women workers. Explain why their invisibility to the state is not an accident, but a structural feature of how the system accumulates. The examiner's distinction here is sharp. A 14-mark answer treats the artificial intelligence initiative as an obviously good, progressive step and moves on. A 19-mark answer refuses to take that at face value. It names the reserve army mechanism precisely. It treats the AI project as one more instance of managerial control dressed in the language of empowerment. And then it brings in a historical explanation for why this gap has persisted since independence. This is where the thinker A.R. Desai earns you real marks. His argument that planning under a mixed economy preserved, rather than dismantled, the agrarian and colonial era class relations it inherited. Close your answer by making the distinction between visibility and entitlement explicit. Better data is not the same thing as legal recognition. And that is exactly the line that will make an examiner sit up. Here is a probable 20-mark question from this event. Capital requires not full employment, but a reserve army whose insecurity disciplines the wage. Critically examine this formulation with reference to the informalization of women's work in India. This is a quote question. You are expected to recognize Marx behind the formulation immediately, without being told his name. Our fourth event is from Paper 2, Systems of Kinship in India, specifically the household dimensions of the family. The Supreme Court has ruled that the offense of cruelty applies equally within live-in relationships, not only within registered marriage. This is a quiet ruling, but for our purposes, it is an unusually clean example of the law catching up with how people actually live. Anchor this short note on Anthony Giddens and his idea of the pure relationship. Giddens described a shift in intimate life where a relationship is no longer sustained because of external obligation, property, or religious sanction, but purely because it continues to satisfy both partners. By extending cruelty protection to live-in couples, the Supreme Court is effectively agreeing that the household itself, not the marriage certificate, is the unit that deserves protection. That is Giddens' pure relationship, arriving in Indian family law. Your quotable formulation from Anthony Giddens' book, The Transformation of Intimacy. The pure relationship is entered into for its own sake and continues only so far as it delivers enough satisfaction to each individual to remain within it. Now, for extra marks, set this directly against G.P. Murdoch, who argued that the nuclear family, built on marriage, is a universal unit found in every known society. A ruling that protects an unregistered household directly complicates Murdoch's assumption of one universal sanctioned family form. This is a 10-mark short note, so the examiner's expectation is different but no less exacting. At 150 words, a complete answer must open by naming the pure relationship in its first two sentences, not by summarizing the judgment in general terms. It must use the ruling in exactly one or two sentences as evidence, and it must close by stating clearly what settled assumption about the family this ruling unsettles. Here, Murdoch's claim of one universal, marriage-based family form. A response that only summarizes the judgment without naming Giddens' concept precisely will read as current affairs, not as sociology. And at this length, that gap is impossible to hide. Here is a probable question built as a comparison. Compare and contrast Murdoch's functionalist conception of the nuclear family with Giddens' account of the transformation of intimacy in the context of contemporary trends in kinship. Whenever you see two thinkers placed against each other like this, both must receive equal treatment. And the real marks lie in the point where they genuinely diverge. Let us bring today together in 5 points. 1. Foucault's disciplinary power explains how the doxing of protesters disciplines a far wider population than those actually named. 2. Frank's dependency theory explains the inequality behind the Ceuta crossing, while Castells and Durkheim explain why the reaction to it was so disproportionate. 3. Marx's reserve army of labor, sharpened by Taylor's scientific management, explains why artificial intelligence alone cannot formalize India's informal women workers. 4. Giddens' pure relationship, read against Murdoch's universal nuclear family, explains why the Supreme Court's ruling on live-in couples matters for kinship theory. And 5. In every single case, the rule is the same. The event is your evidence, the theory is your destination, never the other way round. That is today's brief. This preparation is long, and some days it will drain you far more than it energizes you. That is simply the shape of this examination, and the aspirants who keep showing up on the quiet, difficult days are usually the ones who are still standing at the end of it. If you would like the complete answer blocks, the model answers, and the examiner notes behind everything covered today, including one event we held back from this video, drop your email in the comments or write to us at team@upscdesk.com and we will share the details. Until tomorrow, keep syncing your current affairs with the right thinker and the right concept. That habit alone is what separates a good script from a ranking one.